Imagine a world where 200 million people never died in Europe's deadliest plague. Would we have faster technology today? Would kings still be ruling over us? Would our cities be so overcrowded we couldn't even walk down the street? Here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. That world almost existed, and the fact that it didn't is the reason you can quit your job tomorrow, why you don't bow to a lord, and why you're watching this video on a device that probably wouldn't exist. Let's travel back in time and change one history-defining moment, the Black Death of 1347, and see just how radically different our world would look today. But first, let me ask you something. Do you think you're living in a world shaped by death? Because by the end of this journey, you'll realize that everything around you, your freedom, your opportunities, even your ability to dream big, exists because of the most devastating catastrophe in human history. So what exactly was this world-changing disaster? The Black Death struck Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the 14th century, starting around 1347. But calling it just a plague doesn't capture the sheer scale of destruction we're talking about here. Picture this. In just 4 to 7 years, 1/3 of Europe's entire population disappeared. We're talking about 75 to 200 million people dead. To put that in perspective, it would be like losing the combined populations of the United States and Canada today in less than a decade. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. People had absolutely no idea what was killing them. Imagine living in a world where your neighbor goes to bed healthy and is dead by morning, where entire families disappear in a week, where the smell of death hangs over every city like a permanent fog. The plague traveled along trade routes faster than news could spread. Merchants would arrive in ports already dying, spreading the disease before anyone knew what was happening. Ships would drift into harbors with entire crews dead, creating floating tombs that still carried the infection. Now here's where it gets really interesting for us as Americans. Imagine if tomorrow, every third person in New York vanished. Every third person in Los Angeles gone. Every third farmer, teacher, doctor, builder, just wiped out. The cities would be ghost towns, the countryside would be empty, and the survivors would be left asking, what do we do now? But here's the crucial part. The survivors didn't just ask that question, they had to answer it. And their answers literally created the world you live in today. That's exactly what happened in medieval Europe. Entire villages were abandoned. We're talking about thousands of ghost towns that you can still visit today in Europe. Cathedrals that took centuries to build sat half-finished, their construction sites looking like ancient abandoned projects. Trade routes that connected the known world ground to a halt, creating the first global economic recession in human history. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical death toll. Imagine watching your entire understanding of the world collapse. People believed that God controlled everything, that the social order was divinely ordained, that suffering had meaning. But when random death struck everywhere, those beliefs crumbled along with the bodies. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. This wasn't just destruction. This was the moment when the modern world was born. And the survivors didn't even realize they were creating our future. Now let's talk about what actually happened after this catastrophe, because this is where the story gets absolutely fascinating. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed an entire way of life and created the world you live in today. First, let's talk about the massive labor shortages. Imagine you're a surviving peasant in 1350. Yesterday, your lord owned you. You worked his land from sunrise to sunset. You couldn't leave his property. You couldn't marry without his permission, and you had absolutely no rights. Your grandfather was a serf, your father was a serf, and your children would be serfs. That was just how the world worked. But suddenly, 2/3 of the workers are dead, and every lord in the region is desperately competing for your labor. What happens? For the first time in centuries, you have power. You can demand higher wages, wages that would have been unthinkable just years before. You can actually negotiate your working conditions. You might even be able to save enough money to buy your own land. Let me give you some real numbers here. Before the Black Death, a farm laborer might earn 2 pence per day. After the plague, surviving workers were demanding 6, 8, even 10 pence per day. That's like your salary tripling overnight just because there aren't enough people to do your job. This is how feudalism, a system that had controlled Europe for nearly 1,000 years, started crumbling almost overnight. The survivors suddenly had choices, leverage, and most importantly, the ability to say no to their masters. Think about that. The ability to say no to authority was literally born from this catastrophe. But the changes went way deeper than just economics. Let's talk about the religious revolution that followed. For centuries, the Catholic Church had taught that suffering was God's will, that your place in society was predetermined by divine plan, that questioning authority was sinful. The Church was the most powerful institution in Europe, controlling not just spiritual life, but education, politics, and even international relations. But when the Black Death killed priests, bishops, and peasants equally, when it wiped out entire monasteries while sparing some criminals and sinners, people started asking dangerous questions. If this is God's plan, why did he spare me and not the bishop? Why did my neighbor die and not me? If God really controls everything, why couldn't his own priests save themselves? These weren't just philosophical questions. They were revolutionary ideas that shook the foundation of medieval society. This crisis of faith didn't just change how people thought about God, it changed how they thought about authority, period. It planted the seeds for religious reform movements, scientific inquiry, and eventually the radical idea that maybe kings weren't chosen by God after all. Now here's something that might surprise you. The acceleration of science and medicine that followed was incredible. Before the Black Death, medical knowledge had barely progressed for centuries. Doctors still believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and thought disease was caused by bad air or moral failings. But when you're watching everyone around you die from an invisible killer, you get very motivated to understand how disease actually works. This desperation drove real innovations in anatomy, surgery, and even early forms of public health that wouldn't have existed otherwise. For the first time, doctors started performing systematic autopsies to understand what killed people. They began documenting symptoms and tracking the spread of disease. Universities started teaching medicine based on observation rather than just ancient texts. The plague forced medieval society to choose between old superstitions and new knowledge, and survival demanded they choose knowledge. And let's talk about what happened to cities and politics. With so many people dead, the survivors inherited wealth and property at unprecedented rates. A blacksmith's apprentice might suddenly inherit 3 shops and a manor house. A merchant's daughter could find herself owning trade routes across Europe. Cities that had been overcrowded became manageable. New trade opportunities opened up as old merchant families died out and new players entered the market. Political power shifted from old noble families to nouveau riche merchants and survivors who seized opportunities in the chaos. But here's what I find most fascinating. The survivors didn't just rebuild the old system, they built something completely new. They created the first worker protection laws, the first guilds with real bargaining power, the first systems of social mobility based on merit rather than birth. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Every single aspect of medieval society was transformed. The economic system, the religious system, the political system, the social system. Everything changed. But now I want you to really think about this. What if none of this had happened? What if the Black Death never existed? All right, now we're going to do something really fun. We're going to play with history and imagine a world where the Black Death never happened. And I want you to really think about each scenario I'm about to describe, because some of these possibilities might shock you. Let's start with feudalism. In our timeline, the Black Death broke the back of feudalism and created the conditions for modern democracy and capitalism. But what if those labor shortages never happened? What if lords never had to compete for workers? There's a very real possibility that feudalism could have survived much longer, maybe even into the modern era. Think about it. No labor shortage means no bargaining power for peasants. No bargaining power means no social mobility. No social mobility means the same families stay in power for centuries longer. You might be living in a world where aristocratic families that ruled in 1300 are still ruling today, where your last name determines your career, your income, and your entire life trajectory, where the idea of working your way up or following your dreams doesn't exist because your social class is fixed from birth. Imagine if America had been colonized not by people fleeing European oppression, but by European nobles who brought the feudal system with them. You might be living in a country where dukes and counts still own vast territories, where you need permission from a lord to move to a different state, where your children's futures are determined by who their great-great-grandparents were. Now let's talk about cities and population. This one's really fascinating and kind of terrifying when you think about it. In our timeline, the massive population loss allowed cities to rebuild, reorganize, and develop more efficiently. But what if those 200 million people had lived and continued having children? We could be looking at medieval cities with populations of 10, 20, maybe even 50 million people, but with medieval infrastructure. Imagine London or Paris with the population of modern Tokyo, but with 14th century sanitation, transportation, and food distribution systems. The overcrowding would be absolutely catastrophic. Picture trying to get clean water to 50 million people using medieval aqueducts and wells. Imagine trying to remove waste from that many people without modern sewage systems. The disease outbreaks would be constant and devastating. We might have seen even worse plagues than the Black Death, just from the impossible living conditions. Would you want to live in a city where disease spreads instantly because people are packed together like sardines? Where there's not enough food, clean water, or even space to walk? Where the air is so polluted from cooking fires and waste that you can barely breathe? It's possible that such overcrowding could have led to societal collapse long before we reach the modern era. But here's where it gets really interesting from a technological perspective. Now, you might think that having more people means faster technological progress, right? More minds working on problems should mean better solutions. But history suggests the opposite might be true. Think about it this way. Necessity is the mother of invention. The labor shortages after the Black Death forced Europeans to innovate. They had to develop better farming techniques because there weren't enough farmers. They had to create more efficient production methods because there weren't enough craftsmen. They had to invent labor-saving devices because human labor had become too expensive and scarce. Without that pressure, would we have seen the agricultural innovations that eventually fed growing populations? Would we have developed the manufacturing techniques that led to the Industrial Revolution? It's entirely possible that technological progress would have been much slower in a world where cheap human labor was always available. Let me ask you this. If you could always hire 10 people to do a job by hand for pennies, would you bother spending years and fortunes inventing a machine to do it? Probably not. But if those 10 people don't exist, or if they're demanding wages you can't afford, suddenly that machine becomes essential. This principle applies to everything from agriculture to manufacturing to transportation. The printing press might have been invented centuries later because scribes were cheap and plentiful. Water mills and windmills might have developed more slowly because human and animal power was sufficient. Even basic tools and techniques might have stagnated because there was no economic pressure to improve them. Now let's think about global power dynamics, and this is where things get really complex. The Black Death primarily devastated Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia connected to major trade routes. But what if Europe had remained at full strength? What if there had been no power vacuum for new nations and empires to fill? It's possible that European expansion into the Americas, Africa, and Asia could have happened even earlier and more aggressively. With larger populations and no internal recovery period needed, European powers might have had even more resources to project globally. The Spanish conquistadors, who arrived in the Americas with a few hundred men, might have arrived with thousands instead. But here's the flip side. Maybe other regions would have developed differently too. Maybe the Ottoman Empire would have expanded further into Europe with no plague-weakened Christian kingdoms to stop them. Maybe Chinese or Islamic powers would have dominated global trade routes more completely. Maybe the balance of world power would look completely different today. Here's a really mind-bending question. In this alternate world, would the Americas have been colonized by Europeans at all? Maybe Chinese explorers would have reached the Pacific coast first. Maybe Islamic traders would have established the first permanent settlements. Maybe the entire history of the New World would be completely different. And what about the indigenous peoples of the Americas? In our timeline, they were devastated by European diseases because they had no immunity. But if European populations had been larger and more diverse, If trade networks had been more extensive, if global contact had happened earlier, maybe disease exchange would have happened gradually over centuries instead of catastrophically over decades. Here's a question I want you to really think about. In this alternate world, which countries or regions do you think would be the superpowers today? Would America even exist as we know it? Would it be a Chinese colony, an Islamic empire, a collection of still independent indigenous nations? Would the same European powers have been the ones to explore and colonize? Or would it have been a completely different set of players? Now, before we wrap up, I want to connect all of this to something you can relate to. Something that happened in your lifetime that might give you a taste of what those medieval survivors experienced. Think about COVID-19 and how it changed our world in just a few years. Remote work exploded from a rare perk to a standard expectation. Entire industries transformed overnight. Restaurants became delivery services. Schools became online platforms. Offices became Zoom calls. People reconsidered their careers, their relationships, their priorities. Workers gained new bargaining power and started demanding better conditions, higher wages, and more flexibility. Companies that had resisted change for decades suddenly adopted new technologies in a matter of months. We saw the rise of new business models, the fall of others, and a complete reshuffling of how we think about work-life balance. And we're still feeling those changes today. Now imagine that impact multiplied by 1,000 and spread over decades instead of years. That's what the Black Death did to medieval society. But here's what I find really fascinating. Do you think crisis accelerates progress? Looking at both the Black Death and COVID-19, it seems like humanity's biggest leaps forward often come not during peaceful, stable times, but during moments of absolute chaos and necessity. The Black Death forced medieval society to innovate or die. It forced them to question everything they thought they knew about work, authority, science, and social organization. COVID-19 forced us to embrace digital technology, rethink our priorities, and adapt to new ways of living and working. What does this tell us about human nature? Are we only capable of major change when we have no other choice? When survival itself depends on abandoning the old ways and embracing something completely new? And here's something to consider. What crisis might be coming next that could reshape our world as dramatically as the Black Death reshaped medieval Europe? Climate change could force us to completely reimagine how we live, work, and organize society. Artificial intelligence might eliminate entire job categories and create new ones we can't even imagine yet. Maybe it's something we haven't even thought of yet. A new pandemic, an economic collapse, a technological breakthrough that changes everything. The survivors of the Black Death couldn't have imagined that their catastrophe would lead to the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, or eventually the modern world you live in. So what transformations might we be on the brink of that we can't even see coming? Here's what really gets me thinking. Are we living through one of those historical moments right now? Are the changes happening around us today going to seem as revolutionary to future generations as the Black Death seems to us? Will people 700 years from now look back at our time and say, that's when everything changed? So here's what we've discovered today. One single event, the Black Death of 1347, didn't just kill 200 million people. It killed feudalism. It killed the idea that your birth determines your destiny. It killed the notion that authority can't be questioned. And in killing those old systems, it gave birth to everything we consider modern. Your ability to choose your career, to move between social classes, to question authority, to live in a well-planned city, to benefit from scientific medicine, to have workers' rights, to live in a democracy. All of this traces back to a plague that happened 700 years ago. But here's what I really want you to understand. Those medieval survivors didn't set out to create our modern world. They were just trying to survive, to rebuild, to make sense of the chaos around them. They made decisions based on immediate needs. We need workers, so we'll pay them more. The old authorities failed us, so we'll try new ones. The old medicine didn't work, so we'll try to understand disease differently. And those small survival-based decisions accumulated over generations to create the world you wake up in every morning. Your morning coffee exists because medieval survivors created new trade networks, Your job exists because they invented new forms of employment. Your government exists because they questioned old forms of authority. Think about that for a moment. You are living in a world built by people who never intended to build it. They were just trying to get through another day, another year, another generation. But their adaptations to crisis became the foundation of everything you consider normal. Now that brings us back to our original question. How would you feel about living in that alternate timeline? Would you want to live in a world where feudalism never ended? Where overcrowded medieval cities house 50 million people each? Where technology advanced much slower because there was no pressure to innovate? Where the same noble families from 1300 still control everything today? Or are you grateful for the world that crisis created, even though it came at such a terrible human cost, even though it was built on the graves of 200 million people? Do you appreciate the freedoms and opportunities that their sacrifice, however unwilling, made possible? Here's my challenge for you. Think about the biggest what-if scenario from this alternate timeline. Maybe it's those mega cities with impossible populations. Maybe it's kings and dukes still ruling America. Maybe it's technology that developed completely differently. Maybe we'd have incredible art and architecture, but no computers or modern medicine. Maybe it's a world where other civilizations, not Europeans, became the dominant global powers. Whatever your wildest prediction is, I want to hear it in the comments below. But here's what I'm really curious about. Do you think that alternate world would be better or worse than ours? Would humanity be happier, more stable, more peaceful? Or would we be trapped in systems of oppression and limitation that we can barely imagine today? The most creative and thoughtful theories will get pinned, and I'll feature the best ones in my next video. Because here's the thing, understanding how past crises shaped our world helps us prepare for the changes coming our way. And speaking of future crises, here's one more question for you to think about. What current crisis do you think might reshape the world as dramatically as the Black Death did? Is it climate change forcing us to completely reimagine civilization? Is it artificial intelligence eliminating the need for human labor? Is it something we haven't even recognized as a crisis yet? The people living through the Black Death probably didn't realize they were witnessing the birth of the modern world. They just knew their world was ending. So what world might be ending right now? What world might be being born? If you found this journey through alternate history as mind-blowing as I did, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're going to be exploring more of these incredible what-if scenarios from the Dark Ages. And trust me, some of the stories I have lined up will completely change how you think about medieval history and its connection to your daily life. Next week, we're diving into another medieval game changer. What if the Vikings had successfully colonized North America? How would that have changed everything from the language you speak to the food you eat? The connections we'll uncover will shock you. The past isn't just old stories collecting dust in history books. It's the blueprint for understanding our present and predicting our future. Every single day, you're living the consequences of decisions made by people who died centuries ago. And the decisions you make today will shape the world for centuries to come. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through time, and I'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue exploring how the Dark Ages built the modern world.